Hello there and welcome back to Laurence Plays Factorio Planetary Pioneers, where you join me once again on Corrundum because I've drawn some pretty diagrams and thought that would help us all get our heads round the rather convoluted production chains on this planet. The first part of this is dealing with the sulphur and the basic sort of production of the science pack. And so we've got a nice healthy input of sulphur coming in from the mines over somewhere off to the east. So that's working quite nice. That's one raw resource. And then the other raw resource we've got is the petroleum gas being pulled up out of the lakes down here. So we've got those two. And then, as you can see over here on the left-hand side of the diagram, we can combine those in these catalytic chemical plants in order to get hydrogen sulfide out. So that's a good step in the right direction. But to get this planet going on the route that it intends to go on with later, you can see that this is returning quite a lot of petroleum gas back to the previous stage. This is going to be a running theme on this planet. There are then two options with this hydrogen sulfide. You can either turn it into water and sulfur dioxide with this recipe here, where you produce a load of water and the sulfur dioxide, lovely. Or you can combine it with some of that sulfur dioxide, which also produces water but gives you some of your sulfur back again. So that's why we've got the return belt around here, and that's the deal with this tangle here on the diagram, which allows us to then get water out, which is a very, very important resource, and also some sulfur dioxide, which we're going to be using later and in the next step, which we're doing over here, which is where we turn the sulfur dioxide and some water into sulfuric acid, another very important resource that we're going to be using in quite a few places. And then that sulfuric acid, when combined with some of the sulfur that again is coming in from the mine, so it's nice and easy, and some platinum that we're producing from a completely separate process, that's just from cooking the ore, so that's nice and easy. All those together allow us to make the battlefield science packs. So that's not too bad. It is a kind of twisted tangle of different recipes where the arrows are going all over the place, as you can see here. But because quite a lot of it is fluids, you can almost just say, well, this one's a producer, so make sure have it feed into the tank. This one's a user, so make sure it takes out of the tank. And as long as you keep the tanks at about the right level and do some balancing on things like water, then it's not too bad. This was sort of manageable. It then continued along a similar net route, where if you take some of that sulfuric acid we made earlier and combine it with the chalcopyrite that's coming in from a mine, so again, that's another raw resource, then you produce this blue goop that is apparently a mixed sulfate solution. Because the chalcopyrite contains both iron and copper, it's going to actually be quite useful, and that then we can make a mixed sulfate solution, and then if we add iron to it, we can pull some of the copper out. So you can see here we're doing a reactive displacement, and apparently this works because the iron is more reactive than the copper, and so can displace the copper ions in the solution. That actually makes a certain level of sense based on my very limited chemistry knowledge. But this then kicks out the copper ore that you saw us using earlier to make, well, copper, and that's working reasonably well, and it's leaving us with the green goop, the iron sulfate solution, which we can then do forced reduction on using electricity, and that forces the iron out in the form of ore, which we can then take away to turn it into iron. So we've got a bit of a loop here where that can then be fed back round here. But because there's both iron and copper in the initial ore that's going in, we can put in some iron to take out the copper, and then take out the iron that we put in and the additional iron that was already in the solution, and we'll get a net positive amount of iron coming out. So this system does work. This then leaves us with the dilute sulfuric acid, and well, actually there's a few ways to deal with this. The one I've shown on the diagram is the one that we're using, but there are a couple of others as well that just throw away more or different parts of the solutions, and we talked about that in the last video, so I won't go into all that detail again. Suffice to say, we've decided that trying to turn some of it back into water over here and blowing off as much as we can as steam to produce power seems to be probably the way to go, although we may need to think it through if we start to have any problems. And that's basically it for everything from sulfur through to the metals processing chain. So now we look at it laid out like this. It's not too bad, but it is sort of quite entertaining to see all these long arrows swooping back to earlier in the production process, showing just how much sort of circular production is going on in here. And we're hoping that we're going to be able to keep everything reasonably balanced by producing things like water and sulfuric acid at the right times and in the right amounts. And so far it seems to be going okay. So for example, we've managed to keep this tank here about half full, which is where we're aiming to load it up to. Slightly over actually right now, but it's not overflowed, so that's okay. The water does seem to have maxed out, which is potentially a problem, but hopefully we're going to be able to deal with that by passing some of the steam off to the tanks up here and then using it for power. And you can see these steam tanks are not completely full, and that should allow the water to not be a problem, because we are just turning as much steam as we can back into water and then only using the excess from that to produce the power over here. And we've got another method of producing power as well, which I shall talk about in a few minutes. The final complex part of resource production on this planet is getting the plastic out, and that's a slightly weird process that involves taking some of that petroleum gas we've got so much of, turning it into solid fuel, and then using sulfuric acid to process more of the petroleum gas to turn it into light oil, which incidentally allows us to make rocket fuel, but we don't care about that right now. But then we take in all of these things, along with some sulfur dioxide, and that produces plastic on the output over here. So we do have plastic available. This, as processes go, is a relatively simple one because there are no weird loopbacks. So it's just keep feeding stuff in at the beginning. If you don't have enough of it, feed more in. Eventually you'll get the products you need out at the other end. And so that's the 3 phases of resource production on this planet. We've got the basic sulfur processing over here to get up to acid. Then we've got all the metal stuff over here. And then down here we've got the plastic production. The rest of it is all pretty standard. Like we're taking in the ores over here, we're turning them into metals. That's pretty standard. You've seen that a million times before. Down here we're doing platinum processing, but that's just putting in ore and turning it into plates. That's fairly straightforward. Down here we're making circuits, but that just, again, this is all very, very standard. It's these 3 phases over here that are the weird things that I thought it was worth having another look at. And so, since the last video, we've made some improvements over here. We noticed that the iron ore is getting used up much more slowly, or at least proportionally more slowly than the copper ore is. You can see that along here by the fact that there's lots and lots of iron ore, the belt is completely full, but there's not actually all that much copper ore running along here. There is a little bit backed up at the end, so we're not doing too badly. We haven't run out completely, but we're a little bit low. And at some points we had run out completely, and so Mark has put in a system over here where he's monitoring how much copper ore is on the belt over here. And this reads the whole belt, the entirety of it, all the way down to here where it goes into the splitter over here. And then he's saying if there's not enough of it, as there isn't at the moment, if there's less than 60, then we want to recycle the iron ore that's coming out of here by putting it into a recycler, which puts it into the other recycler. It goes back and forth, but until it's completely destroyed. Because if you remember, every time a recycler runs, it gives out a quarter of what it's carrying. Yeah. Or it'll turn it into the components of that thing. But over here, it's just passing through. A quarter of the amount goes into this one, then a 16th comes back through, and that's basically all of it gone. Then you've got enough. You can just churn back and forth through it, and it'll eventually all disappear. And that means we've then got a nice flow of both of the ores coming through here. We can make sure we've always got enough of them, even if it does mean we're wasting a certain amount of the iron that's being taken out of here. But iron is the product that we have too much of, and because we effectively produce both of them through the same process, there's not really anything we can do about that. And even if we did find another way of voiding the iron, we would still be voiding the iron, so it's going to be slightly lossy one way or another. It doesn't really matter. The other part of the processing over here is that I've significantly increased the amount of dilute sulfuric acid processing. So all of this is now, well, I've roughly doubled it, more than doubled it in fact, because there's a little bit of a weirdness down here, but roughly doubled it. And that's dealing with all the dilute sulfuric acid that's produced by the iron production step of this process, and then turning it back into steam and sulfuric acid. The sulfuric acid then gets recycled, goes back in over here to dissolve the chalcopyrite, and the steam we've discussed already. Some of it gets turned into water, some of it gets used as power. Speaking of power, the other exciting thing that Tristan's put in quite recently is this red boiler setup down here. And this is interesting. So we're taking the petroleum gas out of the lakes once again, and we're feeding it into the red boiler, which is a new type of boiler. And basically that seems to burn the petroleum gas in the oxygen that's from the atmosphere, because there's a decent amount of oxygen in the air here. There's just also a huge amount of carbon dioxide. So we're burning that, and that's producing high pressure carbon dioxide, which is then coming down through here and then being pumped into these thermoelectric engines. And these are functionally, they're steam engines, except they run on carbon dioxide instead of steam, and that allows us to generate a decent amount of electricity just straight out of the gunge in the lakes over here, and very, very quickly produce decent amounts of power. And he's put this in amongst the accumulator field over here, partly because it's a really handy place for getting the petroleum gas out, and we've already got all the roboport coverage and so on, and also because we've already got all the electrical coverage here, because there's the lightning collectors and there's the substations. This is just quite a nice place to start building power production, even if it does mean that we've had to squeeze out some of the accumulators and possibly put them somewhere else. Now, yes, we could have expanded out somewhere else, but it's a bit of a process, because this is one of those planets, because we have the lightning storms here, you have to go out, you have to put in the lightning collectors, and ideally you want to do those first, because otherwise things get damaged. But you need to have the roboports out there in order to be able to put them in place. And the roboports need the substations in order to power them, and you kind of want to have the substations near the lightning collectors so you can collect the energy from them. So it's a bit of a sort of a silly process to try and produce all of that, but it does work and it can be done, and that's how we've expanded out across the rest of the planet. But this seemed easier at the time. And this is now able to generate a decent amount of the power we're using. And if we have a look at the power consumption, well, I've set us to always day at the moment, so things are a little bit weird. But if we look back over the last sort of long period of time, you can see that back here when things were running fairly normally, we were using up some of the power from the accumulators, sure. But we're also generating a decent amount of the power from, well, the orange line here is these thermoelectric engines, the ones that run on the carbon dioxide. Then we've got the green line, which is generation from the turbines higher up. So between those two, we are probably producing a significant proportion of the amount of electricity we're using. That is then, however, being significantly topped up by the accumulators, but they get recharged every night by the lightning storms. And so between the three sets of power, we do have a decent amount of electricity available, and things do work even though we have quite a long day-night cycle on this planet. At one point, the circuit production system down here was struggling quite a bit. We didn't have enough cable coming in. And so Tristan has boosted that by putting in an additional 4 foundries over here that are taking in the molten copper that's coming down from the cold copper processing system up here, and then turning that into huge quantities of copper cables. So that seems to be more than enough. At the moment, we don't seem to be doing very much with it, so that's probably part of the reason why it's absolutely fine. But we are producing in plenty of copper cables now, and that system is not going to go hungry later on. This is probably, though, part of why we're using up so much copper through the from the system along here. So yeah, but we need it all. We need those circuits because we need to make rockets out of them. So it is important stuff to have. Finally, for this planet, Tristan has set up supplying both platinum plates and the catalytic chemical plants to space via the rocket silos over here. They're being brought over by bot because we don't need them in particularly large quantities, and it's probably easier than running the belt all the way over here. And those can then be shipped out back up to the dynamic storyteller, ready to be shipped off to Norvis or wherever else requires them. And the catalytic chemical plants are worth having because they run significantly faster than the normal ones. They have a few extra recipes they can do because of the platinum catalysts in them, and they give you an extra module slot as well. So they're going to be, I think we probably won't go around and upgrade every chemical plant around the entire solar system to these ones because there's no real need to. But in places where we could do with a bit more speed for whatever reason, or we want to run some more productivity modules in there, or perhaps if we're short of space, then these would be quite good ones to use. So I think there's a decent chance we'll end up with some of these on spaceships at some point in the not too distant future. This spaceship does of course also carry the science packs over, so we've got a nice supply of electrochemical science packs being delivered over to Norvis. And you've all seen how the system over there for receiving the science packs works in the last few videos, so we won't go over that again. And so now, let's take a look at some of the researches we've unlocked from those last couple of planets. So, we went out to Corrundum, as I said, and that's allowed us to immediately get the chalcopyrite processing, because all you have to do is dig some up for that. And similarly with the platinum processing, we just need to get some of the ore, and that allows us to learn how to make it into plates. From the platinum processing, we're then able to get the catalytic chemical plants, and then onto the electrochemical science packs, so that's some good progress there. And then we can actually start using those science packs. But first, we needed to work through all that sulphur process I was talking about before. So first off, there's burning some sulphur to get some sulphur dioxide, and that unlocks hydrogen sulfide. You can then make some hydrogen sulfide. You then get water and sulfuric acid being made in slightly weird ways from the hydrogen sulfide itself. And then a rather easy one here, you only have to craft 10 sulphur. Now I wonder if that counts as includes mining in the crafting process, or whether you have to actually make that with the new recipe. I'm not sure, but that then gives you another way to make make water from hydrogen sulfide. So I suspect, going back to the diagram again, this would be allowing you to use the recipe that produces the sulphur and relatively small amounts of water, and then when you've made 10 pieces of sulphur from that, you then unlock the slightly better one that produces lots and lots of water and more of the sulphur dioxide. From there we can get the sulfate processing, so once we've got some sulphur dioxide, we can then start unlocking things like being able to get rid of the dilute sulfuric acid, which is very, very useful. And then from there we can get on to actually doing normal researches where you use actual science packs. So we do things like calcium sulfate production, which we've not actually used at all. It apparently gives us a way to make asphalt and another way to make concrete, but we haven't found that particularly useful yet. So whilst we've unlocked it, we haven't actually used it. It also gets a stone production, where you bring in a small amount of stone along with some carbon and calcium sulfate, and you get more stone. Again, we haven't really needed stone in large enough quantities to have found a use for this one yet, but you never know, we might end up using this in the future. Additionally, that allowed us to unlock the method of making sulfonated plastic. Now this appears to be one that you're supposed to do on planet, because if you look at the rest of your requirement, it only takes red, green, and the new electrochemical science pack. So I think you're probably supposed to produce a bit of all three of these on planet, and then do some science locally before you start shipping the science packs out in huge quantities to go back to the massive research park on Norvis, where we're able to then do research much more effectively. I don't remember if we actually did that. Maybe we just ended up dropping in some plastic or some low density structures or something from space and used those to launch our first rockets of the new electrochemical science packs. I don't really remember. I'll have to wait for somebody to chime in on this one, because if we did drop stuff in, then we've clearly gone slightly against the way you're intended to play this planet. But never mind, that sort of thing does tend to happen. Additionally, down here, once we've got all these things up and running, and now once we've got the packs over to Norvis, we can then invent the pressure laboratory. Now that requires all the different science packs, so this is clearly one you're meant to do back on Norvis. But that produces the pressure lab, the one we were talking about in a recent video, where that destroys all of your low quality science packs immediately. So we haven't found a good way to use those yet, because we're not producing any quality science packs. Maybe we will at some point, and then maybe these will be worth it. But at the moment, we're just not. We're still sticking with the basic science packs and not using this lab because it's a bit too complicated and scary. However, researching that allows us to invent blue rockets, which are interesting. They're like rockets, but they explode a bit harder. So you get both, essentially with the blue rockets, you get both the normal impact damage that you get from a yellow rocket and the area of effect damage that you get from a red rocket. So they're essentially both rockets in one, and they're far more effective and far more powerful, and I'm sure we're going to find them very, very useful. But you do require some sulphuric oxidizer in order to make them, but that's not too bad, especially if you try and make it on somewhere like Corrundum where there's abundant sulphuric acid and obviously loads and loads of solid fuel as well. It also gave us dry ice production, so this is where our little fridges have come from, the ones that we haven't actually been able to use yet because we don't have bioflux, eggs or agricultural science. But you know, that's going to be useful in the future. We've got platinum thrusters, which use platinum and tungsten to make them that bit tougher and stronger, and apparently that allows them to withstand the heat from consuming incredible amounts of fuel, so presumably that means they're just more powerful. They use more fuel and you go faster. That seems quite useful, although at the moment we don't have too much trouble with the speed of our spaceships, but you know, a little bit of improvement can't be a bad thing there. And we've got sulphur poison capsules, which, given how little we use capsules at the moment, is probably not going to be that useful. Unrelated to Corrundum, we've also developed the rail support foundations, which allow you to build, as it says here, allows you to build your elevated rails on the deep parts of the oil oceans on Fulgora. I think they may be useful elsewhere as well, although I don't remember for sure. But they're a step forward, and they'll allow us to be a bit more flexible on Fulgora and perhaps some other places too. We've invented the Personal Roboport Mark II, so we can now run more robots out of our personal armours and over a slightly larger area. We've invented Quality Module 3s, and these give a 2.5% bonus on quality, so if you can get a lot of those into a machine, that could be a sizable bonus, especially if you put them in something like a Forge, which already has a significant bonus on already. And that brings us on to the next planet we've been out to. So, we discovered Castra, we went out there and investigated, we found there was gunpowder, we found there was hydrogen sulfide, and we found there was millerite. So we learned to process all of those, and that taught us about making forges. And the forge is the construction machine for Castra, and as it says over there on the left, it runs at a crafting speed of 2, which is decent. It has a base productivity of plus 25%, which is also quite nice to have. Not quite as good as things like the foundry or the electromagnetic machines, but they're still pretty handy. But it also comes with a base quality bonus of 10%, and that is very interesting because it allows you to get quite a significant head start on some of the quality bonuses that we're going to be getting when we try and make some of the more advanced bits and pieces for our armours. So that could be quite nice to have. Unlocking that has got us the Battlefield Science Pack, and that takes us on into all the exciting Castra related stuff that we're going to be able to do in the future. So far we've not done a huge amount of that. We've looked into Castra enemy monitoring, which allows us to tell what research the enemies on Castra are currently researching. Not enormously useful, but it does allow us to then start developing the jammer radar, which I think is going to be very, very handy for trying to prevent things going badly wrong on Castra. You've seen some of the problems we've had with the various turrets spawning in over there. Hopefully we'll be able to use this to prevent that from happening. We've also researched the advanced nickel processing, which allows you to turn carbon and millerite into lots and lots of nickel and a little bit of iron. I'm not sure how useful this is going to be right now because we seem to have more nickel than we need and not enough iron. And the other nickel production recipe produces more iron compared to the amount of nickel it produces. But you never know, we might be able to find a use for that. And I think we discussed some ideas around this and maybe we'll be able to do something useful with it. We shall see. And then we get on to the sort of the infinite researches. Things like we've unlocked electric weapons damage 3, so our electric weapons do a bit more damage. And lots of productivity researches. These are the ones that increase the amount of output you get every time you run the recipe. So they're like putting productivity modules in a machine, but without the energy and speed penalties. And of course, they can be stacked with productivity modules as well. And so, running through these fairly quickly, we're now making more copper plate when we run the copper plate production on Igris. We're making more pipes, we're making more blue circuits, we're making more rocket fuel. We get more stuff coming out of our scrap when we recycle it. We make more steam turbines whenever we try and produce one. We make more steel plates, more sulphuric acid, more thruster fuel, and water recycling gets us more water back. So, quite a lot of different ones in there, but they're all basically the same idea, so I'm not going to go through them in any more detail than that. And on that productive note, I think it's time to end the video. So thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been interesting seeing how our last two planets are coming together and all the researches that have poured out of them. We'll be back to play some more of this on Monday at 7:30 PM UK time, so make sure you come along then to see how things are coming together in real time. And if you fancy giving Planetary Pioneers a shot yourself, then you can grab the mod from the Factorio mod portal. It's called Planetary Pioneers, and it'll give you all the planets and mods we're using and all the basic settings we started off with. I'll also be back on Wednesday at 8 PM for another stream where at the moment I'm playing Foundry, which is a similar sort of game, but with a third dimension and some ludicrously large buildings. Videos will be coming out every Thursday and Friday as usual, so don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. You wouldn't want to miss out on any of those. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.